My mom didn't even open my folder. She just slid her glass of wine a little to the side and said, "If you want to go to college that badly, you'll figure it out," like she was giving me life advice instead of shutting a door in my face. And the worst part wasn't even the words, it was what happened right after, because at the same table in the same conversation, she reached into her purse and pulled out a check, $120,000, and placed it in front of my younger sister Chloe, like it was nothing like it had always been hers, like we weren't sitting there breathing the same air sharing, the same last name just existing in completely different realities. And Chloe didn't even hesitate. She smiled, said, "Thanks, Mom," and tucked it into her notebook like it was a receipt. Like it didn't just redraw the entire map of my life in 10 seconds flat, and I remember sitting there with my hands still resting on the folder. I had spent 3 weeks preparing scholarship breakdown tuition estimates, a budget that actually made sense, and realizing none of it mattered. Not the numbers, not the plan, not the fact that I had done everything right. Because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit for years. This wasn't about money, it never was. It was about who they believed was worth investing in, and that wasn't me. And my dad sat there like he always did, staring at his plate, cutting his chicken into smaller and smaller pieces, like if he focused hard enough on that, I wouldn't have to say anything out loud. And I waited just for a second for him to step in to say something simple like, "We'll figure this out," or even, "That's not fair," but he didn't. He just cleared his throat and reached for his water like this was any other dinner, like nothing important was happening. And my mom leaned back in her chair, completely calm, completely sure of herself, and said, "Chloe has a different path." And I remember asking different how, even though I already knew the answer, and she didn't even look at me when she said it. She has more potential, just like that, clean, efficient, like she'd said it before, and would say it again if she needed to. And that was the moment something in me just went quiet. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet, like a switch flipping off because there was nothing left to argue. No angle. I hadn't tried no version of this conversation where I came out with anything other than exactly what I was getting, which was nothing. And I didn't cry, not there. I just nodded, like I understood even though I didn't, and I closed the folder. And I finished my dinner, and that was the last meal I ever had in that house, as their daughter, at least the version of me they thought they knew, because 10 years later, I was standing in the back of my sister's wedding watching her walk down an aisle covered in flowers my parents had paid for in a plans venue they definitely couldn't afford when it came to me, surrounded by 200 people who believed a version of our family that had never been true, and I was wearing a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, because I hadn't come there to make a scene. I had come because my dad had sent me a note, just a few words tucked behind the invitation, shaky handwriting like he wasn't sure I'd even read it, and for some reason I couldn't explain. I said yes, even though every logical part of me said, "Don't go, nothing good comes from reopening doors you had to lock to survive." But there I was anyway, standing near the back, close enough to see everything, far enough to be ignored, which is exactly where my mother had placed me, of course, because some things don't change. And I watched her move through the crowd with that same polished smile, introducing Chloe to guests like she was presenting a finished product, something she had built and refined and perfected. And I heard her laugh. I heard her say, "We're so proud of her." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was consistent, because even after a decade, the script hadn't changed. Just the audience had gotten bigger, and for a while, nothing happened. The ceremony was exactly what you'd expect. Music, vows, polite applause, and I thought maybe that was it. Maybe I'd sit through this. Leave quietly. And that would be my closure. Nothing dramatic, just a final. A confirmation that I had made the right choice walking away. But then the reception started, and things shifted. Not all at once, just enough for me to notice, because Chloe's fiancé, Daniel, started moving through the room in a way that didn't match the tone, like he was looking for something or someone. And when his eyes landed on me, he paused just for a second, like something didn't line up in his head, and I held his gaze. Not challenging, not inviting, just steady. And I could see it. happening in real time, that moment when a person realizes the story they've been told might not be complete. And he looked at Chloe, then back at me, and I felt it before anything was said. That shift in the air, like the room hadn't caught up yet, but was about to, and my mother noticed too. I could tell by the way she started moving faster, redirecting conversations, stepping in where she didn't need to, trying to manage something that was already slipping, and I remember thinking not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just with a kind of detached clarity. You can only control a story as long as nobody checks it. And then Daniel stopped in the middle of the room, right between the tables, right where everyone could see him. And he looked at Chloe, and then he looked at me again. And then he said one word, just one, and the entire room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like something had been cut off. Mid-sentence, like the music, the laughter, all of it just dropped out at once. And in that silence, 10 years of carefully managed narrative started to come apart faster than anyone in that room was ready for. And I didn't move. I didn't step forward. I didn't need to, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to explain anything. I kept my eyes on the table that night, but the truth is none of it surprised me, because that dinner didn't start anything. It just confirmed what had been true in our house for as long as I could remember. And if you walked into our place in Seattle, back then, you would have thought everything was fine. Clean kitchen, matching furniture, family photos lined up like proof that we had it together. But if you stayed long enough, you'd notice something small that didn't quite sit right. Like how every framed picture on the wall somehow centered Chloe birthdays, school awards, vacations. She was always in the middle, always the focus. And I was either cropped to the side or missing entirely. And it wasn't an accident. My mom, Diane Collins, didn't do accidents. She curated everything the Scatter. How's her friendships, the way people saw our family, and most of all, the story she told about her daughters. And in that story, Chloe was the one with promise, the one who needed support, the one destined for something bigger, and I was there, not a problem exactly, but not a priority. Either more like background noise you learn to tune out over time, and she never said it in a way that could be called cruel. That's what made it worse. It was always wrapped in something that sounded reasonable on the surface. Like when neighbors came over and she'd introduce us, she'd put her hand on Chloe's shoulder and say, "This is Chloe, she's going into healthcare. She's always been so driven." And then she'd glance at me like she just remembered I existed and say, "And this is Avery." No follow-up, no detail, just my name, like that was enough, like there wasn't anything else worth mentioning. And people would nod, smile politely, and move on. Because if your own mother doesn't have anything to say about you, why would anyone else? And I learned early how to fill in the gaps myself, to stay quiet, to not expect recognition. Because expecting it only made the absence louder, and the house itself reflected that difference in ways you couldn't ignore if you were the one living it. Chloe's room was always being updated. New furniture, fresh paint, a desk she barely used, but somehow always needed replacing, while mine stayed exactly the same year after year, like time didn't apply to me. And if I asked about it, my mom would say, "Yours is perfectly functional. Avery, you don't need all that extra stuff." Like wanting the same level of care was somehow excessive. And the refrigerator was probably the clearest example of how things worked. It was covered, completely covered with Chloe's achievements, certificates, photos, little notes from teachers, even things that didn't mean much were displayed like trophies. And one time sophomore year, I got on the honor roll. Nothing dramatic, just something I worked for. And I printed out the certificate, put it right in the center with a magnet. Not to compete, just to exist. And when I came home that afternoon, it was gone. And I didn't ask at first. I just looked around the kitchen, checked the trash like maybe it had fallen, and my mom was sitting at the table flipping through a magazine. And when I finally asked, she didn't even look up. She just said, "The fridge was getting cluttered, and that was it." No apology, no explanation beyond that. Just a quiet correction of something that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. And moments like that stacked up over time, not big enough to call out individually, but together they built something you couldn't ignore, a pattern, a system. And my dad, Thomas Collins, existed in that system in his own way. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, he just wasn't there when it mattered. and I used to think that made him better, safer somehow, but silence has its own kind of damage. Especially when it shows up at exactly the wrong moments, like when my mom would say something that crossed a line just enough for him to notice, and I'd look at him waiting, hoping for even a small interruption, that's enough, or let's be fair, but he'd just shift in his seat, maybe clear his throat. Maybe give me that quick glance that said he knew and then do nothing. And later, when my mom wasn't around, he'd find me in the hallway or the garage and say something like, "You're doing great, Avery, I'm proud of you, always quiet, always quick," like it was something he wasn't supposed to admit out loud. And I remember thinking how strange that was, that pride had to be hidden, like it would cause a problem if it was shared openly. And over time, I stopped waiting for him to step in, because he never did, not when it counted, not when it could have changed anything. And Chloe, to her credit, wasn't openly cruel either. She didn't need to be. The system did the work for her. She grew up inside it, benefiting from it, believing it, and when everything in your environment tells you that you're the one who deserves more, you don't question it, you accept it as normal. So when she got things, she didn't gloat, she just expected it, like that's how it was supposed to be. And in a way that made it harder to resent her directly because she wasn't creating the imbalance, she was just living in it. And my mom made sure that imbalance stayed intact, not through obvious favoritism, but through consistent, subtle reinforcement, the kind that shapes how people see themselves without ever having to say it outright. And by the time we reached that dinner table conversation years later, the one where everything finally surfaced, the roles were already set. Chloe as the investment, me as the one who should be grateful for whatever I could figure out on my own, and my dad as the man who would notice all of it and still choose not to interrupt, and sitting there that night watching it play out exactly the way it always had. I realized something that took me years to fully understand. This wasn't just how my family behaved, it was how they defined reality. And if you didn't fit into the version they had decided for you, they didn't adjust the story, they adjusted you, or they tried to, until you either accepted it or walked away from it entirely. I set the folder down in front of me and flattened it with both hands so it wouldn't curl at the edges, and for a second I just looked at it because I had spent weeks getting every number right, every line clear, every assumption realistic, and I knew if I rushed this, my mom would shut it down before I got past the first sentence, so I waited until she finished her second glass of wine and leaned back in her chair, the same way she always did when dinner was basically over, and conversation shifted from polite to honest. And then I said, I got into the University of Washington, simple, direct, no build-up, and she nodded like she'd already heard it, because she had. But I kept going anyway. I got a scholarship that covers a little over half. I just need help with the rest. And I slid the folder toward her, not too fast, not like I was pushing it on her, just enough so it was in her space. Something she'd have to acknowledge, and she didn't touch it. Not right away. She just glanced down at it, then back at me and said, "Avery, we've talked about this," and I felt that small flicker of irritation because we hadn't. Not really, not in any way that counted, but I kept my voice steady. We haven't actually gone through the numbers. And I opened the folder myself, flipping to the summary page I'd highlighted. It's about $62,000 over 4 years after the scholarship. I've already factored in part-time work, housing, everything. This is just the gap. And I pointed to the number, like if she saw it clearly enough it would feel manageable, reasonable, something a family could figure out together. And she watched me for a second, then leaned back again and said, "You need to learn to be independent," like she was repeating a line she'd already decided on before I even sat down. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, and I said, "I am being independent. I got the scholarship. I built a plan. I'm just asking for help with the part I can't cover yet." And that's when she reached for her purse. And for a second, I thought maybe she was going to look at the numbers, maybe even take the folder. But instead, she pulled out a checkbook, flipped it open, and started writing. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like this was something she had already planned, and I felt my chest tighten. Not because I knew what she was doing, but because I didn't, and that uncertainty was worse. And then she tore the check out, slid it across the table, but not toward me, toward Chloe, and said, "This should cover your first year in housing." And Chloe looked down at it, smiled, and said, "Thanks, Mom," like this was normal, like this was expected. And I sat there with my folder still open in front of me, my numbers still laid out, my plan still sitting between us, and I said, "You're paying for her full tuition," not accusing, just stating what was clearly happening, and my mom nodded, completely calm. Chloe's situation is different, and I asked how because I needed to hear it out loud. I needed her to say the thing she'd been implying my whole life, and she folded her napkin carefully, like she didn't want to rush the explanation, and said, "She has potential that needs to be supported." And there it was, clean, simple, impossible to misinterpret. And I looked at my dad then, because even if I didn't expect him to fix it, I expected him to react, and he didn't. He kept his eyes on his plate, his fork, moving in small, controlled motions, like if he stayed focused on that, the conversation would pass over him without requiring anything. And I said, "So I don't." And my mom finally looked directly at me, not angry, not defensive, just certain. "You're resilient. Avery, you'll figure it out." And I remember thinking how convenient that was. How being labeled resilient meant you didn't deserve support. It meant you were expected to absorb the impact and keep going. And I said, "That's not the same thing." And she shrugged slightly, like we were debating preferences. "Not. Future's life isn't always equal." And Chloe shifted in her chair still, holding the check, not saying anything, not stepping in, just existing inside the version of reality that worked in her favor. And I felt something in me start to settle, not in a good way, more like a door closing quietly. And I said, "I'm not asking for equal, I'm asking for fair." And my mom shook her head once, small, decisive. This conversation is over, and that was it. Not a discussion, not a negotiation, just a decision, delivered like it had already been finalized somewhere else. And I closed the folder slowly, not because I needed the time, but because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rush, of seeing me react. And I stacked the papers neatly, like they still mattered, like the effort that went into them still had value, even if she refused to acknowledge it. And dinner continued around me, or at least the motions of it did. My mom asking Chloe about orientation, Chloe talking about dorms and classes and everything she was excited about, and my dad nodding along at the right moments. And I sat there listening, realizing I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. Not really. I was just present. And when I stood up to take my plate to the sink, no one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay, because from their perspective, everything had gone exactly the way it was supposed to. And later in the hallway, my dad caught up to me, and for a second, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was where he said something real, something that acknowledged what had just happened. But he just put a hand on my arm and said, "Your mother has her reasons." And I looked at him, waiting for the rest of it, waiting for anything that made that sentence mean more than it did. And he added, "Just give it time." And then he let go and walked back toward the living room, back to the version of peace he had chosen years ago. And I stood there for a second, not angry, not even surprised anymore, just clear, because that was the moment I understood there wasn't going to be a different outcome. Not later, not if I explained it better, not if I waited. This was it. This was the line. And once you see something that clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to hoping it was a misunderstanding, because it wasn't. It was a decision, and it had already been made. I packed one suitcase and didn't overthink it, because if I stopped to consider everything I was leaving behind, I might have hesitated. And hesitation wasn't something I could afford that night, so I kept it simple. A few changes, a bit of clothes, my laptop, the folder I'd brought to dinner, even though I didn't need it anymore, and whatever cash I had left in my wallet. And I moved quietly, not because I was afraid of waking anyone up, but because I didn't want a conversation, not another one, not after the way the last one ended. And the house felt different as I walked through it, not emotional, just smaller. Like once you see something clearly, the space it takes up in your life shrinks. And I paused in the kitchen for a second, not to look around, just to set my key down on the counter. next to the coffee maker, exactly where my mom would see it in the morning. No note, no explanation, because I'd already said everything I needed to say, and she'd already made her decision, and there was nothing left to clarify. And when I stepped into the garage, the light was already on, which caught me off guard because I hadn't expected anyone to be there. And my dad was sitting in the driver's seat of his car, engine off hands, resting on the wheel like he'd been there for a while, and we made eye contact through the windshield. Not dramatic, not intense, just direct. And for a second, I thought he might open the door, step out, say something that actually mattered. Something that changed the direction of what was about to happen, but he didn't move. He just stayed there, looking at me the way you look at something you don't know how to fix, and I stood there, holding my suitcase, waiting longer than I probably should have, giving him time to decide to act, to do anything other than sit there, and he didn't. So I nodded once more out of habit than intention and turned around and walked out, because at some point, waiting for someone else to make a move becomes its own kind of trap, and I wasn't staying in that house 1 minute longer than I had to, and the air outside was cold in that early morning way that makes everything feel sharper, more real. And I walked down the driveway without looking back, not because I was trying to prove a point, but because I didn't need to see it again to know exactly what I was leaving behind, and the bus stop was about a 10-minute walk from the house. And I remember noticing things I'd never paid attention to before: the sound of my suitcase wheels on the pavement, the way the streetlights buzzed faintly, the fact that no one else was out yet, like the world hadn't fully started, and I was already in motion. And when the bus came, I got on, found a seat near the back, and set my suitcase next to me. And that was it. No big moment, no realization hitting all at once, just a quiet shift from one life to another. And the ride to campus took about an hour and a half. And I didn't sleep. I just sat there watching the streets change from residential to commercial to something closer to what I'd have to navigate on my own now. And by the time I got there, the sun was starting to come up, and the campus looked exactly like it had during orientation. The same buildings, the same walkways, but it felt completely different now, because this time I wasn't arriving with a safety net. I was arriving with a suitcase and a plan that suddenly had a lot more pressure on it than it did the day before, and my dorm room was on the 3rd floor, and when I opened the door, it was exactly what you'd expect: a thin mattress, metal frame bed, a desk that had seen better days, and a window that didn't quite close all the way. And I set my suitcase down, looked around for a second, and realized I'd forgotten something basic: sheets, blankets, anything that made the space livable beyond its bare function. And I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it fit. Of course I'd miss something like that. Of course the first night would be a little harder than it needed to be. And I ended up sleeping in my jacket, curled up on top of the mattress, using my folded hoodie as a pillow. And it wasn't comfortable, but it was mine, and that mattered more than I expected it to. And the room was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No background noise from the TV, no conversations happening in the next room, just the occasional sound from the hallway and the faint hum of the building itself. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, not thinking about the future, not planning anything, just existing in that moment, because that was enough for the first night, just being there, just knowing I had actually left, that I wasn't going back the next morning. That there wasn't going to be a conversation where everything got smoothed over and returned to normal, because normal had already been defined, and it wasn't something I was willing to accept anymore. And at some point I fell asleep without realizing it, and when I woke up a few hours later, still in my jacket, still on top of that bare mattress, I didn't feel scared the way I thought I would. I felt clear, not comfortable, not secure, but clear, like the noise had been stripped away, and all that was left was what I had to do next. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like something I could actually work with. I didn't give myself time to adjust, because adjusting implies there's a softer version of what you're walking into, and there wasn't. So by the end of that first week, I had 3 jobs lined up and a schedule that only made sense if you stopped thinking about sleep as something you needed every night. I worked evenings washing dishes at a small Italian place a few blocks off campus, where the steam from the sinks clung to your clothes no matter how long you stood outside afterward. I picked up overnight shifts at a gas station off the highway, where the fluorescent lights made everything look slightly unreal at 3 in the morning, and on weekends I cleaned common areas in the residence halls, bathrooms, hallways, whatever they needed, and I stacked those hours together like it. That was a puzzle I had to solve, just to stay enrolled. 4 hours of sleep here, a nap there if I was lucky, coffee when I could afford it, leftovers from the restaurant when I couldn't, and I told myself it was temporary, just something to get through until things stabilized. But the truth is, nothing stabilizes when you're running that close to the edge. You just get better at pretending it's sustainable. And there were mornings I sat in class staring at the board, knowing the material was something I should be able to follow, something I had followed before, but my brain felt like it was moving through water, slow, delayed, like everything had to travel farther to reach me. And I fell asleep once during a lecture and woke up to my own pen rolling off the desk, and no one said anything, which somehow made it worse, because it meant I blended in, even in that, even in failing quietly, and I burned my hand during a dinner rush one night, not badly enough to go to the hospital, but enough that it blistered across 3 fingers and made holding anything painful for days. And I wrapped it myself in the back room with supplies from a first aid kit that had probably been there longer than I had, and I still showed up to class the next morning because missing a class meant falling behind, and falling behind meant risking the scholarship, and losing that meant everything stopped. And there wasn't a backup plan, there wasn't a safety net I could fall into while I figured things out. It was this or nothing. And 2 weeks in, I made the mistake of calling home. Not because I expected anything to be different, but because part of me still thought maybe distance had softened something, maybe enough time had passed for the conversation to reset. And my mom answered on the second ring, and I said, "Hey," and before I could even explain why I was calling, she said, "You made your choice, Avery, don't call to make me feel guilty." And then she hung up 7 seconds. That was the entire conversation. And I stood there in the hallway outside the gas station break room looking at my phone like it might say something else, if I gave it a minute, but it didn't, and I saved her number under a different name, not for drama, just for clarity, so I wouldn't have to think about it next time it popped up. Later that night, Chloe texted me, "Mom says you're being dramatic. You can come home if you apologize." And I read that message 3 times, not because it was confusing, but because it was so consistent with everything else the narrative had already been written. I wasn't the one who had been left without support. I was the one who chose to leave the difficult one, the dramatic one, and I didn't respond because there wasn't anything I could say that would compete with a story they had already committed to. And over the next few months, that version of me spread through our extended family faster than anything I could have corrected. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started calling asking why I was doing this, to my parents telling me my mom was heartbroken that I needed to fix things before it was too late, and every conversation followed the same pattern. I'd start to explain, they'd interrupt, they'd defend her, and by the end of it, I was somehow the one apologizing just to end the call, and eventually I stopped answering those too, not out of anger, but because I didn't have the energy to argue with people who had already decided what they believed, and at some point, the physical exhaustion and the emotional noise blended together into something constant, something I stopped noticing in pieces and just carried as a whole, and my grades started to slip, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, enough that I knew if I didn't change something, I was going to lose the one thing keeping me there. And that scared me more than anything my family had said or done, because this was mine. This was the only piece of my life that hadn't been decided for me, and losing it would mean starting over in a way I wasn't sure I could recover from. And there were nights I sat on the edge of that dorm bed, still sleeping in the same jacket half the time, because I hadn't gotten around to buying proper bedding, and I thought about how easy it would be to just go back, to accept their version of events, to apologize for something I hadn't done, just to make the pressure stop. And that thought stayed longer than I'd like to admit, not because I believed it was right, but because I was tired, and when you're tired enough, wrong starts to look like relief. But every time I got close to that point, I remembered that dinner, the check sliding across the table, the way my mom didn't even look at the folder I'd built, and something in me pushed back, not loudly, Not dramatically, just enough to keep me where I was, and over time that quiet resistance became more reliable than anything else in my life. Not a big turning point, not a sudden shift, just a steady refusal to go back to a place that had already made it clear what I was worth to them, and that was enough to get me through one more shift, one more class, one more week. I started to notice the cracks before anything actually changed, like when I walked into Dr. Michael Grant's office thinking I was about to get a warning about my grades, and instead, he closed the door, sat across from me and said, "You look like you're running on fumes," not accusing, just stating a fact I hadn't admitted out loud. And I gave him the short version, not the whole story, just enough to explain why I was barely holding everything together, and he listened without interrupting. Without that polite nod people give when they're waiting for their turn to talk, and when I finished he didn't tell me to work harder or manage my time better. He pulled out a folder from his desk and slid it toward me the same way I had done at that dinner table months earlier, but this time someone actually wanted me to open it. And inside were applications for research assistant positions, small grants, campus programs I hadn't even known existed, and he said, "You're not the first student who's had to figure this out without help, but you're one of the few who can actually turn it into something." And I remember sitting there thinking how different that felt, not because he was saving me, but because he was treating me like someone worth investing in without needing to compare me to anyone else. And I took the application, filled it out that night, between shifts, and within a few weeks, I was working in his lab, nothing glamorous, mostly data cleanup, organizing patient records for a study that wasn't going to make headlines, but it paid enough to replace one of my overnight shifts, which meant I could sleep a little more, think a little clearer, and for the first time since I'd left home, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to everything around me. I was starting to move in a direction I chose, and around the same time, Sophia Ramirez started sitting next to me in one of my classes. She had this way of talking like she didn't have time for anything. Fake, no small talk, no polite filters, just straight to the point. And the first thing she ever said to me was, "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days," which wasn't far off. And instead of brushing it off, I said I haven't. And that was enough to start a conversation that turned into something more consistent. We studied together, grabbed cheap food when we could share notes, when one of us missed something. And one night, sitting outside the library with vending machine snacks because that's what we could afford, I told her everything, not the edited version, not the short explanation, the whole thing, the dinner, the check, the call, the way the family had rewritten the story. And she didn't react the way most people did. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "That's awful." She just listened, finished her sandwich and said, "You know you don't owe them anything, right?" And I remember pausing there, because that wasn't how I'd been thinking about it. Even after everything, part of me still felt like I had to fix it, like I had to prove something, earn something, come back with enough success that they'd finally see me differently. And she shook her head slightly like she could see that whole thought process playing out and said, "You're trying to win a game. They already decided you can't win. That's not on you." And that sentence stayed with me longer than anything else anyone had said up to that point, because it shifted something I hadn't realized was holding me in place. I wasn't just trying to build a life. I was trying to build a version of myself that would finally make sense to them. And once I saw that, it became harder to ignore how much energy I was wasting on something I didn't actually need. And the combination of those two things, Dr. Grant giving me a path that didn't depend on burning myself out, and Sophia giving me a way to think about my situation that didn't revolve around my family, created a kind of reset. Not overnight, not dramatic, but steady. And I started making decisions differently. I dropped one of my jobs and replaced with more hours in the lab, which felt risky at first, but it paid off in ways I hadn't expected. I started focusing on the work that actually moved me forward, instead of just keeping me afloat, and I stopped checking my phone every time an unknown number called, because I already knew what those calls sounded like and I didn't need to hear them again. And there was this moment, maybe a few weeks into that shift, where I was sitting in the lab late at night finishing a data set that had taken me longer than it should have, because I was still catching up on sleep. And I realized I hadn't thought about going back in days. Not seriously, not in that maybe I should just fix it way. And that absence felt different, lighter, like something had been removed that I didn't have to carry anymore, and it I wasn't that my situation had suddenly become easy. I was still working, still balancing everything, still one bad month away from things getting complicated again. But I wasn't doing it with the same constant pressure to justify myself to people who had already made up their minds, and that made a difference. I could actually feel not just in my schedule or my grades, but in how I showed up to everything more focused, less reactive, more willing to invest in things that had a return beyond survival, and over time that shift started to compound. Small improvements, stacking on top of each other in ways that didn't look impressive from the outside, but felt significant from where I was standing, and I didn't make a big decision to cut my family off completely there. Wasn't a dramatic moment where I said I'm done. It was quieter than that. I just stopped reaching for something that wasn't there, and in that space, I started building something that was. I started saying yes to opportunities that actually moved me forward instead of just filling time, and the first one that mattered came from Dr. Grant when he asked if I wanted to stay on after the semester to help restructure a messy dataset his team had been avoiding for months. Nothing flashy, just a problem nobody else wanted to deal with, and I took it because I knew I could do it if I gave it enough focus. And for the first time in a while, I wasn't splitting my attention across 3 different jobs. I was putting real hours into something that had a direction, and it showed not overnight, but steadily. I got faster, more precise, more confident in decisions that used to slow me down. And Dr. Grant noticed, not in a big speech, just in small ways, giving me more responsibility, looping me into meetings I wouldn't have been invited to before, asking for my input, instead of just assigning tasks. And that shift mattered because it meant I wasn't just surviving inside the system anymore. I was starting to shape part of it, and around that time, Sophia introduced me to someone she knew from a hackathon, a guy building a basic platform to organize patient intake data for small clinics. Nothing revolutionary, but it solved a real problem. And when I looked at what he had, I could see exactly where it broke under pressure, where it would fail if anyone actually tried to scale it. And instead of just pointing that out, I offered to help fix it, not for free, but not for a lot either, just enough to justify the time. And we spent a few late nights working through the structure, cleaning up the logic, making it usable in a way it hadn't been before. And when it started working, that's when something clicked for me, because I realized the value wasn't just in the code or the data. It was in understanding the system well enough to make it hold under real conditions, and that was something I had learned the hard way, balancing everything at once, building something that didn't collapse when things got messy. And I started taking on more small projects like that. Nothing huge, just consistent work that paid a little better than my previous jobs and connected directly to what I was studying. And over time, those projects started to stack, not just financially, but in terms of experience, credibility, proof that I could build something people actually needed. And by the time I graduated, I wasn't walking into the job market empty-handed. I had a portfolio, references, a clear direction, and I took a position at a mid-sized health tech company that wasn't glamorous but gave me access to systems at a scale I hadn't worked with before. And I paid attention to everything, not just my role, but how decisions were made, where money flowed, what problems kept coming back, no matter how many times they were fixed. And after about a year, I started seeing patterns that weren't being addressed, gaps in how smaller clinics handled patient data, inefficiencies that cost time and money but didn't look urgent enough for larger companies to solve. And that's where the idea for MedBridge came from, not as some big vision, but as a response to something specific. I knew how to fix, and I didn't quit my job immediately. I built it on the side nights and weekends the same way I had done everything else, but this time it felt different because the work compounded in a way that didn't just keep me afloat, it pushed me forward, and Sophia stayed involved, not as a co-founder, but as someone who could call out when something didn't make sense, when I was overcomplicating things, when I needed to focus on what actually mattered. And Dr. Grant connected me with people I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. Small investors, advisors who understood the space, and none of it came easy. There were versions that didn't work, pitches that fell flat, moments where I questioned whether I was stretching too far, but each time something didn't land. I adjusted, not emotionally, just practically. What needs to change? What stays? What actually moves this forward? And slowly it started to gain traction. A few clinics signed on, then a few more, enough to prove the model worked outside of my own expectations. And when I finally left my job to focus on it full-time, it wasn't a leap of faith. It was a calculated step based on data I trusted. And over the next couple of years, MedBridge grew into something stable, not massive, not overnight. Success, but consistent, reliable, something that solved a problem well enough that people kept coming back to it. And for the first time in my life, I had control over something that mattered. Not control in the sense of power over others, but control over direction, over decisions, over how I responded when things didn't go as planned. And I built a team that reflected that people who were there because they could do the work, not because they fit a narrative, and I made sure the systems we built were transparent, fair, not perfect, but intentional, because I knew exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of something that wasn't. And somewhere along the way, without making a big announcement about it, without needing to prove anything to anyone, my life stopped revolving around what I had left behind and started revolving around what I was building. And that shift didn't come with a single moment. You could point to it came from a placed series of decisions that added up over time, decisions to focus, to invest where it mattered, to stop chasing validation from people who had already decided who I was. And by the time MedBridge reached a point where larger clients started paying attention, where meetings included people who made decisions at a level I used to think was out of reach, I wasn't thinking about how far I'd come in comparison to my family. I was thinking about the next problem, to solve the next system, to improve, because that's what kept everything moving, and that's what made the success real. Not the recognition, not the numbers, but the fact that it held up under pressure the way I had learned to do. I was reviewing a contract late one afternoon when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved, and I almost ignored it out of habit, but something about the timing made me pick it up anyway, and the second I heard Chloe's voice say my name, like we had spoken last week, instead of years ago, I knew exactly what this was going to be. Not because she sounded nervous or emotional, but because she sounded comfortable, like the gap between us didn't exist, like she was stepping back into a role that had never changed for her. And she said, "Hey, I didn't know if this was still your number," and I let a second pass before answering. "It is," and she jumped straight into it. No build-up, no apology. "I need a favor," and I almost laughed at that, not out loud, just internally, because at least she was efficient, and she explained that she was between jobs. Something about a transition, a position that hadn't worked out the way she expected. And she needed $8,000 to cover rent and some other expenses until things stabilized. And she said it like it was a bridge, like something temporary that I'd obviously understand. And I asked, "What happened to the job you creased?" Told everyone about. And there was a slight pause, not long enough to call it hesitation, just enough to signal that the answer wasn't clean. And she said, "It wasn't the right fit," which didn't explain anything but told me enough. And I kept my voice neutral. "And you thought of me," and she said, "You're doing well, right? Mom said your company's taking off." And there it was, not concern, not reconnection, just confirmation that I had become useful in a way that fit into their narrative again. And I said, "What exactly did Mom tell you?" And Chloe shifted slightly. I could hear it in her voice. "Just that you're successful now and we're family, so..." And she left the rest hanging like it was obvious. Like the expectation didn't need to be spelled out, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the numbers on my screen, the actual work I had built piece by piece. And I said, "I'm not a backup plan," and she exhaled a little sharper. "This time, it's not like that." And I didn't argue, I just said, "I'm not sending you money." And the silence on the other end lasted a second longer than I expected. Not shocked, just recalibrating. And she said, "Okay," in that controlled tone people use when they're already moving to the next step. And sure enough, within 24 hours, my phone started lighting up in a way it hadn't in years. Numbers I hadn't seen since high school. Relatives I barely remembered, all suddenly very interested in how I was doing, and every conversation followed the same pattern. They'd start warm, casual, asking about my work, my life, and then it would shift subtly at first, then directly, Your sister's going through a hard time. Your mom is really worried. It wouldn't hurt you to help out. And I recognized the script immediately, not because it was new, but because it was identical to what I had heard before, just adjusted for the current situation. And I asked one of them, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade, what exactly did you hear happened? And she didn't hesitate that you've been distant, that your parents tried to support you and you pushed them away, that you've changed since you started making money. And I almost smiled at how clean that was, how consistent, how efficiently the story had been rewritten again. And I said, that's not what happened. And she responded with, well, that's what your mother said. Like that settled it, like the source mattered more than the truth. And I ended the call without arguing. Because I had learned that explaining yourself to someone who isn't asking for the truth is just another way of wasting energy. And over the next few days, the pressure didn't let up texts, voicemails, even a couple of emails from people who clearly preferred something they could point to later as proof they had reached out. And through all of it, my mom didn't contact me directly. Not at first. She let the network do the work, the same way she always had. Shaping the narrative from a distance, letting other people carry it so it didn't look like it was coming from her. And then 3 days in, I got a message from her, just a short one. I'm disappointed in how you're handling this. No greeting, no context, just that. And I stared at it for a second, not because it surprised me, but because it was so consistent with everything else. The framing, the assumption that the problem wasn't the request. It was my response to it. And I typed out a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too, because I knew how this would go. If I engaged on her terms, it would turn into a conversation about obligation, about family, about what I should do, regardless of what had happened before, and I wasn't stepping back into that, not even partially. And instead I sent one message. I'm not discussing this, and turned my phone face down on the desk because the real shift wasn't in what they were doing. It was in how I responded to it. And for the first time, their version of the story didn't pull me back in. It didn't make me question myself. It just existed as something separate from what I knew to be true. And that didn't stop them from trying. The calls kept coming for a while, the comments, the indirect pressure. But without my participation, it had nowhere to land. And eventually, like most things that rely on momentum, it started to slow, not because they changed their minds, but because I stopped giving them anything to work with, and in that space, I could see it clearly how quickly they had shifted from ignoring me to needing me, how easily the old narrative had been updated to fit the new situation, and how a little any of it had to do with me as a person. It was about function, about where I fit into their version of things. And once I saw that, really saw it, it became a lot easier to keep my distance, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Because going back to that system, even for something as simple as sending money, meant stepping back into a role I had already outgrown, and I wasn't doing that again. I was halfway through a demo when Daniel Brooks asked a question that told me he actually understood what we were building, not just the surface pitch. And that got my attention because most people in his position focus on the numbers first and the system later. But he was asking about failure points, about how the platform handled inconsistent records across smaller clinics, and I answered directly, no fluff. Just how we built it to hold under messy, real-world data. And by the end of that meeting, it was clear this wasn't going to be a one-off conversation. This was the kind of client that could shift our growth curve if everything lined up. And when we wrapped, he said, we should continue this. Over dinner, I want my fiancée to take a look too. She works in healthcare admin. And I nodded because that made sense. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. Not until I walked into that restaurant 2 nights later and saw Chloe sitting across from him, laughing at something he'd just said. And for a second, everything slowed down in that way. It does. When 2 parts of your life that were never supposed to overlap suddenly do, and she looked up, saw me, and the expression on her face shifted just enough to register recognition before it settled back into something neutral, controlled, like she was deciding in real time how to handle this. And Daniel stood, smiled, and said, Avery, this is Chloe. And I said, we've met, keeping my voice, even not giving him anything to question. And Chloe said, yeah, small world like this was coincidence and not something that was about to complicate everything. And we sat down and the conversation moved forward like it was. Supposed to Daniel asking about integration timelines. Chloe adding comments about workflow from her side, and I listened closely not just to what she was saying, but how she was saying it, because something didn't line up, not immediately obvious. Just small inconsistencies in terminology, the kind of details you only notice if you've spent enough time inside the system she claimed to work with, and I didn't interrupt, I didn't challenge her there, I just made a mental greeting. Note, because this wasn't the place to test that, and the rest of the dinner went smoothly enough that if you didn't know the history, you'd think it was just another business meeting. And when we left, Daniel said, "I think this could work," and Chloe nodded, adding, "We've been looking for something like this," and I said, "Then we'll set up a pilot and go from there." And that was it. Clean, professional, exactly how it should have been. But the second I got back to my apartment, I opened my laptop and pulled up the preliminary information we had on Daniel's company, and there it was. Chloe's name listed as a senior administrator with credentials that didn't match anything. I remembered not just inflated but specific in a way that could be verified. Degrees, certifications, work history. And I sat there for a second looking at it, not reacting, just processing, because if this was accurate, then I had underestimated how far she had taken the narrative. And if it wasn't, then this wasn't just a family issue anymore. This was something that could impact a contract we were about to sign. And that changed everything. And I didn't jump to conclusions. I ran it through the same process we used for any new client background verification. Credential checks, nothing personal, just standard due diligence. And at first it looked normal records that matched on the surface. But when we dug a little deeper, the gaps started to show inconsistencies between listed institutions and actual enrollment record certifications that didn't fully align, with issuing bodies small enough that they might pass a casual check, but not enough to hold up under a system designed to catch that kind of thing. And I leaned back in my chair, not shocked, not even surprised, just clear, because this was exactly how our family operated. Build a version of reality that worked, reinforce it until it became accepted, and rely on the fact that most people wouldn't look closely enough to challenge it. And for a moment I considered addressing it directly, calling Chloe, asking her what she thought she was doing, but I stopped myself because that would turn it back into a personal conflict, something emotional, something she could deflect or manipulate. And this wasn't that anymore. This was a business decision, and I handled it the same way. I handled everything else in the company, with structure, with timing, with evidence, and I instructed my team to continue the verification process without flagging anything. Externally, no alerts, no warnings. Just collect the data and let it build. And over the next few days, more details surfaced enough to confirm what I had already suspected, that Chloe's position wasn't backed by the credentials she claimed, and that meant the decision in front of me wasn't just about whether to proceed with the contract, it was about how and when to address something that would inevitably surface, and I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to rush it, because timing mattered. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for clarity. And if this came out at the wrong moment, it would turn into noise confusion, something that could be dismissed or explained away. But if it came out at the right time, in the right context, it would stand on its own. And I closed the file not because I was done, but because I had enough to move forward. And for the first time since I walked into that restaurant, I wasn't thinking about Chloe as my sister. I was thinking about her as a variable in a system that either held up under scrutiny or didn't, and I already knew which way this was going. I closed the verification report and didn't say anything. Not to my team, not to Chloe, not even to Daniel, because the information itself wasn't the hard part. It was deciding what to do with it, and that decision needed to be clean, not reactive. So I treated it the same way I treated every other risk and point pressed on the company. I broke it down into what I knew, what I could prove, and what would happen if I acted too early, and the more I looked at it, the clearer it became that this wasn't something you confronted in a phone call or a private meeting, not if you wanted the outcome to hold, because Chloe's entire position depended on perception, on the idea that no one would question her closely enough to force a real answer, and if I gave her time to adjust the story, to explain it away, in a controlled setting, she would. That's what she had been trained to do, and I wasn't interested in playing that version of the game. So I instructed my team to continue as planned, finalize the pilot proposal, keep communication with Daniel focused strictly on the product, and document everything on our side without escalating it externally. And they didn't ask questions because, from their perspective, this was just another due diligence process. Another set of data points we were validating before committing resources, and that's exactly how I wanted it to look. Normal, procedural, nothing personal, and in the background, I built a separate file not labeled in any way that would draw attention, just a clean collection of verified discrepancies, degree records that didn't match enrollment logs, certifications that couldn't be confirmed through issuing bodies, employment timelines that overlapped in ways that didn't make sense, each piece small on its own, but together forming something that couldn't be ignored if it was presented in the right context, and I didn't rush it. I let the data come in naturally. Because forcing it would only introduce doubt, and doubt was the one thing I couldn't afford here. And a few days later, Daniel sent over a draft agreement for the pilot program standard terms. Nothing unusual, and I reviewed it like I would any other contract marking sections that needed clarification, adjusting timelines, making sure our exposure was limited if something went wrong, and I scheduled a follow-up meeting to finalize everything, and when we sat down again, this time in a conference room with actual documentation on the table, instead of a restaurant setting, the dynamic was different, more focused, more precise, and Chloe was there again, presenting herself the same way she had before, confident, composed, using the same language that had passed in casual conversation. But under this level of scrutiny, the edges started to show more clearly. Not to Daniel, not yet, but to me. Every time she referenced a process slightly off, every time she used a term that didn't align with how those systems actually worked. And I let it pass because this wasn't the moment, not yet. And we moved through the agenda timelines, deliverables, implementation phases, and by the end of it, everything was in place for us to move forward. And Daniel said, "Let's lock this in after the wedding." It's been a lot planning that and this at the same time, and I nodded because that made sense from his perspective. And it gave me exactly what I needed: time, not to gather more evidence, I already had enough, but to let the situation reach a point where the truth wouldn't just be information, it would be context, and context is what turns facts into something people can't ignore. And that's when I understood why this felt different from anything that had happened before, because for the first time, I wasn't the one being positioned inside their narrative. I was outside of it, looking at it from a distance, with the ability to decide how and when I engaged, and that shift removed any urgency to confront her directly, because urgency is what drives mistakes, and I wasn't making one here, and over the next couple of weeks I kept everything moving forward on the surface, emails, updates, small adjustments to the proposal, all the normal steps that made this look like a straightforward business deal, and at the same time I finalized the documentation on our end, making sure every claim I could make was backed by something verifiable, something that didn't rely on interpretation or opinion, and I didn't share that file with anyone, not even Sophia, not because I didn't trust her, because I needed this to stay contained until the moment it mattered. And one night, sitting in my apartment, with everything laid out in front of me, I thought about what this would look like if I handled it the way I might have years ago, calling Chloe, demanding an explanation, trying to force a resolution in private, and I could see exactly how that would go. Denial, deflection, maybe even turning it back on me in a way that made me look unstable or resentful, and none of that would actually change the outcome. It would just muddy it, and I wasn't interested in muddying anything I wanted. Clarity, and clarity requires patience, so I closed the file, shut down my laptop, and decided to wait, not passively but intentionally, because the truth doesn't lose its value over time. If it's solid, it just becomes harder to ignore when everything around it is forced to line up against it, and I already knew the moment when that alignment would matter most, just had to let it get there. I adjusted the strap of my dress and stayed exactly where they put me, at the last table near the service door, where the staff moved in and out with trays, because that placement wasn't an accident, it was a message subtle enough to pass, as logistics obvious enough if you knew what to look for. And my Mom made a point of stopping by just long enough to make sure I understood it, smiling that same polished smile she used for everyone else, and saying, "I hope you're comfortable back here." We had to prioritize close family like I hadn't spent 18 years in that house, like proximity had always been conditional, and I nodded, "I'm fine," because I was not in the way she expected, but in a way that didn't require her approval, and she moved on greeting guests, reinforcing the version of events she'd been building for years, introducing Chloe as if everything about her was earned and obvious. And for a while, nothing broke that rhythm. The ceremony had already happened. The reception flowed the way these things usually do. Music, speeches, polite laughter, people checking their phones between courses. And I stayed quiet, not hiding, just not inserting myself into anything that didn't need me. And then Daniel stood up, not for a speech, not at a scheduled moment, just stood in the middle of the room with his glass still on the table, and the first thing I noticed was that he wasn't smiling, not nervous, not emotional, just focused. And that changed the room faster than anything he could have said, because people notice that shift before they understand it. And he looked at Chloe, then at my mom, then across the room until his eyes landed on me, and he said, "Before we go any further, I need to clear something up." And there was that brief pause where people expect a joke, a light comment to ease into whatever comes next. But it didn't come, and my mom stepped in immediately. "Daniel, maybe we can," and he cut her off. Not aggressively, just firmly. "No, this matters," and you could feel the room tighten around that conversations, dropping off mid-sentence, attention redirecting all at once, and he gestured toward me. "Avery, would you come here for a second?" And I didn't rush, I didn't hesitate either, I just stood up and walked to the center of the room, not performing, not reacting, just moving, because the moment required it, and I could feel eyes tracking every step. The same people who hadn't noticed me 10 minutes ago now, trying to place me to understand why I mattered in this context. And when I reached him, he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about who you are," and I almost smiled at that because it was the cleanest way to put it without turning it into something messy. And he turned slightly to face the room. "This is Avery Collins, the CEO of Medbridge." And there it was, simple, direct, no build-up. And the reaction wasn't loud. At first, it was quieter than that. A ripple, people looking at each other, recalibrating, connecting dots that hadn't been available to them before. And my mom's expression shifted just enough to register the impact before she corrected it, stepping forward with a laugh that didn't quite land. "Well, yes, Avery's been doing some work in tech, minimizing it in real time, trying to fold it back into something manageable." And Daniel didn't acknowledge that. He kept going. "We've been in discussions about a partnership for weeks, and now the room had context, not just a title, but relevance. And I stayed still, not adding anything, because this wasn't about me explaining my life. It was about letting the information stand on its own." And then Daniel turned back to Chloe, and the tone shifted again, not louder, just sharper. "And while we're talking about clarity, there's something else that doesn't add up," and Chloe laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to diffuse tension. "What are you talking about?" And he picked up a folder from the table, one I recognized immediately because I had seen the same documentation in our internal files, and he said, "Your credentials," and that word alone was enough to change the room completely. Because now it wasn't curiosity, it was attention, and Chloe's posture tightened just slightly. "My credentials are fine," and he opened the folder not dramatically, just methodically. "The degree you listed from Northwestern doesn't show up in their records," and there it was not an accusation, a statement, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because this wasn't something you could laugh off or redirect with a smile, and my mom stepped forward again. "There must be some mistake," but even she sounded less certain now, and Chloe looked at Daniel, then at me, and for the first time that night, there was something unsteady in her expression. Not panic, but calculation, like she was searching for a version of the story that would hold under this level of scrutiny. And Daniel continued, not raising his voice, not pushing, just laying out facts. "We verified everything as part of the partnership process." And a few people in the room started to shift in their seats, not speaking, just reacting in small ways that signaled the change was already happening, and I didn't step in, I didn't need to. because the structure of this moment didn't require my input, it required consistency. And that's exactly what it had. Evidence, timing, context, and as Chloe tried to respond, words coming out in fragments that didn't fully connect. The version of her that had been presented to this room started to come apart in a way that no amount of explanation could fully repair. And I stood there, not as the person they had overlooked, not as the one who had to prove anything, but as someone who had already built something real, something that didn't depend on this room believing it to exist. And for the first time, the narrative wasn't something I was inside of, it was something unfolding in front of me, and all I had to do was let it happen. I didn't stay long after that, not because I couldn't, but because there was nothing left in that room for me to do. The outcome was already moving in its own direction, and inserting myself into it would have turned it into something else, something louder and less clear. So I picked up my bag, nodded once to Daniel as I passed him and walked out, before the noise started to rebuild behind me, and by the time I reached the parking lot, my phone was already buzzing again. Not with random numbers this time, but with names. I recognized people who suddenly had questions instead of opinions, and I let it ring not out of spite, just because I didn't owe anyone an immediate response. Not anymore. And over the next few days, the consequences unfolded exactly the way you'd expect. When a story built on assumption runs into something that doesn't bend, Chloe's position fell apart, first quietly, at the start a leave of absence that didn't last, followed by a statement from her company that sounded neutral but wasn't, and then the engagement ended. Not publicly, not with a statement, just a shift that everyone noticed anyway, and my mom tried to stabilize things at first, reaching out to people, offering explanations that didn't quite hold together, framing it as a misunderstanding, a clerical error, something that could be corrected if everyone just gave it time. But the problem with that approach is that it only works when the version of events hasn't already been tested, and this one had, and the more she tried to control it, the more obvious it became that she was reacting instead of directing. And that was new. I'd never seen her operate from that position before, and it changed how people responded to her, not dramatically, just enough that the confidence she relied on didn't land the same way. And a week after the wedding, my dad called. Not a message passed through someone else. Not a quiet comment in the background. An actual call. And I let it ring twice before answering. And when I did, he didn't start with small talk. He said, "I should have said something back then." And I leaned against the counterphone in one hand, looking out the window at a view that had nothing to do with where I grew up. And I said, "You didn't." Not accusing, just stating it the way it was. And he exhaled, like he'd been holding that sentence for a long time. "I know," and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just honest, and he added, "I'm sorry," and that word would have meant more years ago, but now it landed differently. Not as something that fixed anything, just as something accurate. And I said, "I appreciate you saying that, because I did, but I didn't follow it with anything else. I didn't open a door, didn't offer a path back to what we used to call normal, because that version of normal didn't exist anymore." And he seemed to understand that, because he didn't push. He just said, "If you ever want to talk," and let the sentence trail off in a way that didn't assume an answer. And we ended the call without making plans, without defining what came next. And that was enough. And my mom reached out a few days later, not through anyone else, this time a direct message that started with, "I think things got out of hand," which was her version of acknowledging what happened without actually owning it. And I read it once, then again, not looking for meaning, just confirming what I already knew, that the narrative hadn't changed. It had just been adjusted to fit new information, and I didn't respond right away, because responding on her terms meant stepping back into the same pattern. And when I did reply, it was one sentence: "I'm not interested in rebuilding anything based on what happened." No explanation. No argument, just a boundary stated clearly enough that it didn't invite negotiation. And she wrote back longer this time, about family, about how things can be repaired, about how people make mistakes. And I didn't answer, because I wasn't trying to win anything. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was just deciding what I was willing to be part of and what I wasn't. And over time, the noise settled, not because everything was resolved, But because I stopped participating in the parts that didn't serve me, and Chloe didn't reach out again, not directly, and I didn't expect her to because the version of me she had known didn't exist in a way she could use anymore. And that was probably as clear to her as it was to me. And the interesting thing about all of it is that I didn't feel the way I thought I would at the end of this. There was no sense of victory. No moment where everything clicked into place and I felt justified in some big emotional way. It was quieter than that, more like something had been put back where it belonged, not in their system, but in mine. And I went back to work the next morning, the same way I always did, reviewing reports meeting with my team, making decisions that had nothing to do with my family and everything to do with what I was building. And that was the point, not the wedding, not the reveal. Not the collapse of a story that had never really held up, but the fact that my life didn't depend on any of it, that I could step out of that entire structure and still move forward without losing anything that mattered. And if there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about understanding where your responsibility ends. Because once you see that clearly, once you realize you don't owe your past an explanation for your future, you stop trying to fix things that were never yours to carry, and you start building something that doesn't need their approval to exist.